pleasure to welcome you to this webinar organized by the Climate Change Working Group of the Scaling Community of Practice. Today's webinar will focus on the key issues of scaling finance for climate change. As you know, until recently, the official goal was to reach $100 billion per year for climate finance. And that goal was reached starting in 2022. However, it is very widely accepted that 100 billion are not sufficient to address all of the investment needs stemming from the ever-increasing speed of climate change that we have been witnessing, especially in these past years. At COP29 in Baku, it was decided to raise the goal to 300 billion annually, provided by wealthy nations to developing countries by 2035. While this would triple the current amount, a recent report by the independent high-level expert group that was led by Amar Bhattacharya, Vera Songwe, and Nick Stern estimates that by 2035, we would actually need to invest 1.3 trillion per year, drawing on all possible sources. That includes the public and private sectors. It includes multilateral development banks that need to step up, philanthropies, as well as drawing on domestic resource mobilization also in developing countries. Now, what does this new 300 billion commitment from Baku mean in the context of this broad financing gap up to the 1.3 trillion? And what innovative solutions or mechanisms are required to scale up investments to meet global climate financing challenges? That is what we want to discuss in the seminar, and we are really excited that Amar Bhattacharya has agreed to be a speaker today and to present to us the messages and reasoning behind the report and what it means that the agreed target was just a quarter of the estimated needs. He will also speak about what can be done to further scale climate finance. And we are equally pleased that Jonathan Bainon from the Center for Global Development and Matt Eldridge from the Gates Foundation, and incidentally, my co-chair at the Climate Change Working Group, will be the discussants. They will bring in their perspectives and recent work on the current financing goals and needs, the political economy, and where we go from here on scaling climate finance. So with this, we will now hear from Amar, followed by Jonathan and Matt, and you can see their bios on the registration website. We also expect to have sufficient time for questions and answers, and please do send your questions in the Teams chat, and we will pick them up from there for that part of the session. So without further ado, welcome, Amar. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Karen, and pleasure to me to be part of this webinar. I have been involved in the climate group of the the community of practice, so it's really nice to be back here again. So I'm going to go through the principal findings of the report that of the report that Karen mentioned, and if I could just run you through the basic messages, and then I would like to end a little bit with what Karen was talking about, which is what came out of Baku in terms of the agreed text and the implications of it. So the central proposition of the work that we've been doing, not just of this last report, but of the work we've been doing for some time, is that climate action is climate investment. If we want to scale up climate action, it is scaling up investment, and investment not just directly in climate, but a broader sphere. And the three areas that we particularly emphasize is the energy transition, adaptation and resilience, and nature. And I'll come to that so here is our estimates of what we believe is necessary, and this is an interesting figure because it places the climate investment within the larger SDG sphere. So we estimated, and this is work that we've been doing under many hats, including the G20 independent expert group on MDB reform, this independent group, a lot of analytical work that we've been doing at Brookings at LSE. And essentially it says that if you look at the climate and nature related investments, we need to be investing about 2.4 trillion a year by 2030. And of that, we see 1.4 trillion coming, in terms of the energy, 1.6 trillion in terms of the energy transition, 250 billion for adaptation and resilience, 250 for coping with loss and damage, nature and natural capital, 300 billion, and just transition, which is small but very important in order to enable the changes to happen. Then the next thing that I want to talk about is the investment imperative. If you look at the past, the reason that we have been falling behind is because we've been underinvesting, and we've been particularly underinvesting in emerging markets and developing countries. In the last 5 years, there has been a significant uptick in clean energy and green investment, but it's almost exclusively in the developed world and China. Emerging markets and developing countries only accounted for 10% of the increase in clean energy investment. Second, the gap between what we need to spend on adaptation and resilience and what we are spending is growing. And as far as natural capital is concerned, 90% of the natural capital of the world is in the developing world. 80% of the spending is in the rich world. But when you look to the future and when you look to the next 10 years, the story is very different. In the next 10 years, something like 60% of the increase in the clean energy investment has to be in emerging markets and developing countries other than China. That's an astounding kind of change. And you see that in the last 3 graphs, where you see emerging markets and developing countries with much lower levels, ending with spending levels that are larger than that of advanced economies as a whole, and twice that of China. Very, very big change that will happen in the next 10 years. And you can see that particularly in the case of renewables. At COP28, there was an agreement that we should be tripling renewables, by 2030. And whereas that's an aggregate goal, in the case of emerging markets and developing countries, the numbers we are looking at is 5 to 10-fold increase, between now and 2035. What is also striking is this is not just a story of Asia or Latin America. It's actually in every developing region that we see this imperative and opportunity for a big increase. And let me emphasize the opportunity. The opportunity comes from the fact that developing countries are endowed with the most abundant and the cheapest form of renewable energy, which is the sun. And if you look at it from the perspective of cost and supply, the cost of renewable energy of a solar panel has dropped to an astounding 10 cents a watt. When we began this journey, it used to be $1,000 a watt, and it's now 10 cents a watt. And the supply of that solar panels is now, 5 times what the world is investing. So we have a unique opportunity in the next 10 years to scale up clean and cheap energy, and using it not just for climate, but using it for development. And the difference between the developing world and the developed world is so much of the story of the developing world is about infrastructure yet to be built. There's another aspect I want to quickly emphasize. That is, if the world, moves to a world of fossil fuel energy, the savings that we accrue are just massive. There are massive direct savings. If you look at the clean energy area, investing in the clean is cheaper than the dirty, but also not consuming fossil fuels is a huge savings for the world. The world spends 2 trillion on fossil fuels. You just imagine if you don't have to consume that. And if you take into account, particularly for emerging markets and developing countries that are oil importers, the savings are really massive. Paradoxically, you don't have to subsidize fossil fuels anymore. There's huge savings in that. As you know, the direct numbers are about $1 trillion. Indirect savings could be as much as $5 trillion. And of course, fossil fuel, electric world is a much more, operations and maintenance effective world. You also have direct savings in terms of nature. And then there are indirect savings or avoided costs, I would call it, in terms of investing in adaptation and resilience. Every dollar you invest brings you back $4 to $10. The environmental and health and other benefits that come are huge in terms of co-benefits. And if you all add it all up, then we get really quite large savings. So where will this money come from? So we looked at many different scenarios based on the types of investment we are talking about. And the types of investment has changed quite dramatically from a largely public dominated set of investments to now a largely private set of investment, especially in the clean energy transition. So based on that and based on the domestic and international, breakdown of finance, we argue that roughly of the 2.4 trillion, roughly 1.4 trillion can come from domestic sources, about 800 to 900 from public, and about 500 to 600 from, and these are 2035 numbers that I'm talking about, 2030 numbers that I'm talking about. I'll mention a little bit of word on 2035, given the focus in the of COP at Baku. Second, we argue that we need about $1 trillion of external finance in 2030, and the breakdown of that is, roughly half is private, 250 billion is MDBs and MDB-like, multilateral concessional finance, and another 250, which is bilateral South-South cooperation and other international finance, including innovative finance. For 2035, the numbers we have are 3.2 trillion rather than the 2.4 trillion, and the domestic part is 1.9 trillion, with an external finance component that Karen was mentioning of 1.3 trillion in needed external finance per year. And this 1.3 trillion is what got picked up then in terms of the agreement at Baku, and I'll come to that in a second. I just want to end with, I won't go through the slide, but I want to emphasize that, in the scaling up proposition, it is not only about the money. It is about an agenda that has to move as much on policy and institutions as possible. And there are several key elements of that, which I will just summarize telegraphically. And then the presentation is available as well, of course, is the report. So the first point I would make is that in order to be able to, undertake the investments, you need a institutional and policy architecture to unlock investments at scale. We do not have that in most countries. Policy underpinnings are weak. Structures for project preparation often are weak. There's also problems associated with national clear and well-articulated national strategies and the like. One instrument for scaling up is country platforms, or country sector platforms, as we call it. This has been popularized a great deal in the last 3 years or so. And this year, we expect it to get a lot of attention, particularly through the major decision structures, the G20 and the COP30 at Belém, or leading up to Belém. So this country platforms idea, especially for this community of practice, is something that is worth focusing on, and the learning experiences from that as an instrument for scaling up. And I can come back to that in more detail. Second, we have to be able to manage the problems of debt, fiscal space, and macroeconomic sustainability. There's quite a lot of divided opinions on how big the debt problem is, but what is absolutely clear is you cannot invest without debt. So solving that is a big issue. I won't go through the details. I just said highlight these things. Third, domestic resource mobilization is absolutely critical in order to be able to get the get the domestic creditworthiness foundations, but also the adequacy of resources that I mentioned. And then the mobilizing the private finance at scale is essential, because of the numbers. I just want to highlight this. Of the numbers, more than $1 trillion, 1.2 trillion comes from the private sector, and that's why it's so important. And the last three items, a scaled up and more effective MDB systems, what we have been calling better, bigger, more effective MDBs, with a big flip to that at the last G20. And the last thing is reforming the concessional finance architecture within which bilateral climate finance sits, but it's much more than just bilateral climate finance. And finally, I want to say that monitoring and tracking will become much more important in the scaling up. So let me just close with COP29, because it's important. So in COP29, there was, first of all, an agreement that the world needs to strive towards this 1.3 trillion of external finance necessary, and a commitment reached to launch a process to deliver, to set out a roadmap to deliver that 1.3 trillion. It's called the roadmap from Baku to Belém. Second, there was an agreement to set a NCQG, which is a funny animal. It's the replacement of the 100 billion, but it's not quite a replacement of the 100 billion. And that number was set at 300 billion. There were two elements in which the 300 billion differs from the 100 billion. The first is that it includes in it also contributions from the developing world, what was being called an expanded contributor base, what we've been calling South-South cooperation. And second, at the very last minute, it was agreed to include all MDB finance, not just MDB finance that is attributed to developed countries. If you take this new nomenclature and you look at our 1.3 trillion, what would be the NCQG? And the answer is it would be at least 500 billion. So when we look at the 300 billion, it is definitely short of the 1.3 trillion target, which itself was agreed upon, as it were. So resolving that inconsistency is something that will be very important in the discussions that will be happening this year leading up to Belém. Let me stop there, and I'll turn it back to Karen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amar, for laying out your report. and not only your the calculations, but also the steps of what would and could be done in order to actually get to the 1.3 trillion. And of course, as we can see, there are some things that might be quite straightforward, but there's a lot that also involves a lot of political economy and what can be done, but where there really needs to be political will, both at country levels and at international levels. I'm now passing to our first discussant, who at the Center for Global Development has recently also done some work specifically on what these 300 billion really mean and if they mean anything, and who will also react to your presentation. So welcome, Jonathan, from the CGD.
Thank you, Karen, and good morning or good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Amar, for your presentation too. So my name is Jonathan Bynum from the Centre for Global Development. I've been working on climate change and climate finance for some years now, previously in the British government, now as CGD. We've done quite a lot of work on the NCQG itself, the new collective quantified goal. Amar, it's really striking listening to your presentation, and it's been through a few iterations over the last year or two. It is really striking how much traction that work has got. And as you say, you know, the 1.3 trillion figure being reflected in the NCQG, I think bears testament to the rigor with which that work has been done. And I think that's very reassuring in many ways, because there are a lot of estimates out there. Some of the submissions coming from different parties to the NCQG, pitching for how big the NCQG should be, were all over the place. And it is a very difficult challenge to quantify. And the fact that there has been some kind of coalition or consensus around your work, I think, has been very helpful. One thing that struck me, just commenting first on your presentation before I'll come on to some of the work that we've been doing, one of the things that struck me was the emphasis you make on these being investment costs. And in fact, there are substantial savings to be generated by investing this money. And I think there are two key points arising from that, or inferences one can make. One is that, you know, if capital and information markets were working better than they currently do, then it should be easier to find those investment resources, because there is a return, there are savings to be had from investing in that. And the second point is that, and I feel we haven't got there yet, politically and publicly, winning the argument to say that this makes good financial sense to spend this money is proving a challenge. And yet, by demonstrating that the savings associated with this spend, both in terms of reduced spend on other things, but also avoided damages, is a very powerful argument for justifying why we need to be taking not just investing in climate change and climate finance, but also all the other policy and regulatory reforms that need to accompany that more seriously than we currently are, and perhaps that politicians currently feel able to. So there's a big political discussion to be had as well. It's not just money and numbers. One other comment I would make is that in that context, therefore, in 2035 is a long way away, and it's very hard to predict what will happen in terms of, you know, technical change, technological change. I can foresee a situation. I know your energy transition was by some margin the biggest element of your total, but I think one can foresee a situation where increasingly the economics of going green are just so incontrovertible that money, especially private money, will flow that way naturally, and the increasing burden will be through adaptation and resilience and loss and damage. And that's where public funding will increasingly need to pay attention to. That's my suspicion. I'd be very interested in other people's thoughts on that. As for the action agenda that you set out, this road from Baku to Belém, I mean, they're all really good points, and I absolutely buy your argument that it's not just about money. There are a whole host of other things that need to happen. And be very interested to hear what other people who join this webinar have to think on that as well. Let me just move on to some of the work that we've been doing, because it's directly relevant to this. So bottom line, when the NCQG was signed, it was gavelled down. I think different people within CUD have slightly different perspectives, but overall, we were just deeply disappointed with the outturn of the NCQG. Yes, and the main reason is because it seemed to us that in spite of all the rhetoric in the 2 years of discussion and negotiation running up to the NCQG, there was lots and lots of references to we must learn the lessons from the $100 billion goal. But it seems to me that substantially those lessons were not learned in the NCQG. And let me run through some of those points. So the $100 billion target was a number plucked out of thin air. It didn't really have any reference point in needs. And if there's one good thing about the NCQG is that it does at least acknowledge this 1.3 trillion figure, which is based on the analysis that Amar and colleagues have done. So that is progress. But the fact that there is currently only this commitment to provide $300 billion from all sources, pretty much expressed or phrased as it had been in the $100 billion in the original goal, doesn't take us very far. There is still this huge gap between 300 billion and 1.3 trillion that needs to be filled. So this road from Baku to Belém is going to be bumpy. There's a lot of work to do. So the number is inadequate. That much is clear. But it's also deeply unambitious. And that was a key point that we wanted to draw attention to. And Gabby, I don't know if you want to pull that chart up onto the screen just now, but we did some work before COP, just fairly crudely looking, well, look, what would happen if developed economies continue to grow as they have been doing in the recent past, and you've got inflation into account as well, then based on the $116 billion of climate finance that was provided in 2022, you could imagine, or you could anticipate that economic growth and inflation alone will take you to $230 billion by 2035. And so anything, a simple doubling of the goal, which what people were maybe talking about at the time, was thought to be unambitious. We've since refined that analysis a little bit. And this chart shows the bar on the left just looks at 2022. The blue block at the bottom captures bilateral finance, but also mobilized private finance and export credits are in there too. And the orange bar is basically the multilateral flows, which between them come to the $116 billion. The hashed bar is what might have been included had this provision that Amar mentioned about those MDB flows, which are actually financed by contributions from developing countries. Had they been counted, you might have got another $13 billion in that total. That's probably an underestimate, to be honest. The different ways of calculating that, and that's probably on the low side. If you look to 2035, essentially what we concluded was that without any additional fiscal effort, so if you look at the climate finance provided as a percentage of developed country economies, GNI, then the economic growth alone would lead you to expect climate finance from bilateral and private sources. This is assuming there's no change in the leverage rates, the amount of private finance that is mobilized for each dollar of public finance. You could imagine that bilateral and private you anticipate it going up to $82.6 billion we have there. For the MDBs, they made an announcement shortly before COP to provide that they expected to provide $120 billion to lower middle income countries by 2030, and that is a stretch, that is an uplift, and it's been achieved by two ways. One is making their balance sheets work harder, and secondly by increasing the proportion of the overall outflows from on average 33% currently to 45%. The first bit is, I guess, a form of extra effort. They're making the balance sheets work harder. The second is really a reorientation of existing spend. So more of it will be categorized and counted as climate finance. It's arguable as to whether that is additional effort, you might say. But that gives you that $64 billion figure in the dark orange bar on the right-hand side. Sorry, forgive me. That 64 is what would happen in a business as usual case. The $31 billion is what those extra amounts of multilateral finance would be associated with sweating the balance sheets and an increasing share going to climate finance. The $18.6 billion figure is what we estimate, and I personally think this is actually an underestimate, could be coming from developing countries as a result of their contributions through the multilateral system, which, as Amar mentioned, the NCQG text now says will voluntarily be counted. And then the final, the greyish box top right, that's just inflation. You know, a dollar's worth more today than it is in the future. If you allowed for inflation, that would contribute another 90 or so. So basically, you're up to $290 billion with pretty much a business as usual, zero ambition scenario. That's why we felt disappointed with the figure that was ultimately agreed. I know politically, government contacts of mine have said we just did not think we could go any further than this. And I know it was hugely contentious, the discussions. But a lot can happen in 11 years. 11 years ago, we didn't even have the Paris Agreement. An awful lot can happen in 11 years. So it did seem to us to be unambitious. Let me just pick up briefly on this developing country share, because it's something that we had advocated for, that it was desirable and appropriate for developing countries to start contributing climate finance, or rather some developing countries. And it's been quite striking how developing countries en masse have said, look, developed countries, you're the cause of the problem. It's up to you to provide the finance to do this. And certainly legally speaking, the Paris Agreement imposes that obligation on a small set of 23 developed countries. And the Europeans and others have said, but the world has changed since that categorization of countries in 1992 was set, and more should be contributing. And they have a point. They undeniably have a point. It's quite striking that if you look at all greenhouse gas emissions since 1850 cumulatively, the share accounted for by the 23 current climate finance providers, it's only 37%. It's actually it's much in the minority now. So there is an argument for expanding the contributor base. Obviously, you need to take into account per capita income, and other variables could do too. We did some analysis, some fair shares work, a couple of blogs that we have on our CGD and more detailed papers that go through this. But we have essentially felt that you could make an argument for 20 to 30% of any climate finance total ought to come from what are currently described as developing countries. That's a relatively small subset of those. You're looking at some of the big Gulf states, China, Mexico, South Korea, countries like that. Interestingly, all of the low-income countries, the lower middle-income countries, including crucially India, your SIDS and your LDCs, which is over 100 countries together, collectively in our allocation model, they would count for less than 2% of any climate finance target. So the sense was that they should be entirely off the hook. It's a relatively small subset, but the case for developing countries providing some climate finance, I think, is very powerful, and many of them already do, but it's just not captured within the official system. But okay, so it's inadequate, it's unambitious, but even if a bigger number had been agreed, maybe we were good to get to the $500 billion figure that Amar was mentioning. But I think as expressed, the NCQG text is still deeply flawed for a number of reasons. First of all, it doesn't really clarify what the baseline is. And we have learned from experience in the past that actually a lot of what is provided as climate finance is just coming out of existing development budgets. So the extent to which it is properly new and additional is limited. And there is nothing in the NCQG that will prevent that continuing to happen. So that, I think, is one difficulty that we have with the text as framed. Secondly, a lot of developing countries quite rightly wanted more emphasis on grant-based assistance coming from public finance. They were very skeptical of the benefits and value of private finance. And there is no public finance target within the NCQG. It just talks about funding from a whole range of different sources, public, private, innovative, whatever. And the lack of a specific public finance target, I think, is unfortunate in many ways, partly because what ideally one would have is a public finance target that is expressed in grant equivalent terms. Currently, there is very limited clarity about what counts as climate finance. There are few rules, and it is the case that a country providing all of its assistance on loan terms, some of it not on very concessional terms, that counts the same as another country which is providing all its assistance as grants. And the way in which the NCQG text is drafted does two things. It actually incentivizes more assistance to be provided in ever less concessional loans, which is the opposite of what developing countries are wanting. Secondly, it makes fair comparison between those countries that do provide climate finance really, really difficult, because the headline numbers are just not comparable. So that is something that ideally would be resolved. Thirdly, another issue that we have with the text is that while it, I think, correctly acknowledges that there is a role for developing countries to contribute, the way in which it is currently phrased basically means that every extra dollar that developing countries provide would in fact let developed countries reduce their own commitments by the same by a similar amount. And I think that's deeply unfortunate. Developing countries, with good reason, were very worried that an attempt to bring developing countries into the contributor base was the developed countries trying to offload responsibilities. And it does feel as if that is what is happening at the moment, which I think is unhelpful and unhealthy in terms of the negotiations that took place. And on the sort of political dynamics of it all, the very fact that developed countries only came in with their offer on the very last official day of COP clearly disappointed and upset an awful lot of parties, particularly from the developing country side. And I think that was tactically, it's made things more difficult in terms of resolving some of the problems going forward, because trust is in short supply. It was in short supply and it's in even shorter supply now. Last 2 points. Ideally would have been some reference at least to burden sharing principles. At the moment, a collective goal is just that, it's a collective goal. No individual party is accountable for anything, and clarifying responsibility for providing certain amounts would be desirable. Penultimate point, loss and damage. In fact, hardly got a look in. Developing countries wanted the NCQG to cover loss and damage as well. It doesn't do so. Personally, in some ways, I'm not sorry about that, because to the extent that the scale and needs of loss and damage are only going to grow, the fact that it is not explicitly captured within the NCQG framework, I think probably will result in there being more powerful demands for extra funding coming for climate finance, including loss and damage. So that might not be the train smash that some people suspect. Last point, is it better than no deal? Now, we had interesting conversations in CGD about this, and some thought, no deal would have been better. Personally, I think no, it was absolutely better. The possibility of concluding without any deal and the ramifications of that, and the distrust and the difficulties it would have for future COPs, I think would have been really, really very, very bad. But it does mean that there's a lot of work to do between now and Berlin to try and address some of these shortcomings in the NCQG. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for laying out the various issues around the NCQG and the 300 billion. I think we will still have time for discussion around that, and also a response by Amar, what it is that gives him hope for actually going towards the higher figure, in spite of the many caveats that you have laid out. One, I think, that is really very important is who are the contributors, and how to expand the contributor base. But also the entire question of what is counted as climate finance, and how can we make sure that it doesn't only mean that other things are not being financed because of the need to define steps towards having reached various goals. So I hope we'll get back to those issues, but I want to give Matt the word as a reaction, actually, both to Amar and to you, and from his perspective, including as a philanthropic perspective of how he looks at the issue of where we stand on scaling climate finance. So floor is yours, Matt.
Great. Thanks, Karen. And I would co-sign what my esteemed co-panelists, Amar and Jonathan, have both said, and hopefully build on some of those points and encourage folks to please drop questions for them, not me, I'm just kidding, all of us, into the chat box, please. So I'd say, I think first, given political and fiscal realities in high-income countries, it's highly unlikely that we're going to see significant increases in ODA. I think that's pretty commonly understood, especially in the near term, and that while the NCQG outcome was disappointing, it's not entirely surprising that we saw that. Faced with this dire ODA outlook and the urgent need to scale climate action, there has been a flurry of activity around a broad set of what you might call innovative finance models. So this includes things like proposals that are being floated for international taxes or levies, carbon credits, carbon markets, various interesting bond instruments, insurance products, etc. We should absolutely keep advocating both for more and better financing, especially ODA. And we should fully explore these innovative financing approaches and deploy all forms of finance at scale. But that's not what I want to talk about, because the quantum of finance is not the only thing that matters, right? It's scaling climate action and improving impact also depends on how we spend resources and what we spend it on. So in other words, the efficiency and effectiveness of the finance. This should make you optimistic, like it makes me optimistic, because there's actually a lot we can do in this space on the efficiency and effectiveness, even while we wait for additional financing to be forthcoming. So with this in mind, I think there are three themes that I heard a lot about in Baku, and that I think we'll see a lot of progress on and more discussion on the road to Belém and beyond. The first of these is related to reforming the international financial architecture. So a lot has been said in the past couple of years, and even done in the past couple of years, on reforming the MDBs, as Amar said, to make them bigger, better banks, performing better for their members, hopefully. However, there's still potential to strengthen the efficiency and impact of the entire system. So on this front, there's encouraging momentum to improve local access to finance by strengthening the partnerships between the MDBs and the national development banks, as well as ongoing efforts to harmonize climate funds, address some of the fragmentation that's there, standardize procedures, processes, accessibility of the funds, and improve their overall operational efficiency. We've seen encouraging momentum through the G20 process on both of these things. And at COP in Baku, countries reaffirmed intent for more resources to be flowing through the climate funds and interest in getting the climate funds to work a little bit more efficiently. So I think first is the architecture and institutions. So the second theme that I think we'll see more on is related to growth. There is growing recognition that investing in inclusive growth that reduces poverty and advances human development outcomes is absolutely critical to addressing climate change. The best way to build resilience to climate change and to contribute to global climate goals is by not being poor. So growth and development is essential for achieving the climate objectives and climate goals that we have. And as Amar noted, this is not just an urgent imperative. There's also a unique opportunity that's presented here in emerging markets and developing countries. There's clear alignment between development and climate objectives, but many climate policies, strategies, and investment plans have been crafted or implemented without keeping implications for development and growth in mind. Or when these have been in there, they've been included as secondary considerations as part of policies or investment plans. I'm really hopeful that this is starting to change and that development is understood as central and necessary, not as secondary. Climate is increasingly being understood as both a macro-critical risk with implications for policymakers and economic management, as well as an opportunity for countries to rethink their growth strategies and think about their connection to supply chains and trade and what opportunities and sectors are possible for them to invest in and to grow as we go further and further into the century. Countries need support for climate resilient development pathways that are both sustainable and that center human outcomes like poverty alleviation. And I think this is a really exciting time because Brazil has its own unique sustainable development story to tell, the challenges and the opportunities that they've been pursuing. and it's well positioned to host this discussion as the host of the COP30 in the November of 2025, as is South Africa as the new G20 president. The business case for investing in climate action, as Jonathan said, is about growth, and it's a really compelling narrative that can galvanize action and investment. So second area is growth. The third and last areas I'll talk about is the emerging theme on impact. So where is the money going and what impact is it having? Are we making the best use of available resources by ensuring investments with the highest potential impact are being prioritized? How do we know that we're having an impact at the project, the sector, the country, the institution, or portfolio levels? This is particularly an issue for adaptation and resilience, where success can be a lot more difficult to quantify, but it's incredibly important to know whether we're having an impact and whether we're building more resilient communities. The good news is that we have better tools and data than ever to really help prioritize investments and maximize the climate and development benefits of those investments. We now have better hyperlocal data on climate change and climate risks. We have new and better models that integrate climate scenarios with economic data. We're beginning to understand how systemic risk manifests and transmits across an entire economy and society. We have growing evidence on what types of investments work in which places and for which risks. And we have a renewed effort to define and measure what good adaptation looks like. And a lot of those efforts are actually being led by the MDBs. So countries in particular, their ministries of finance are really adopting these tools and resources to help ensure that their investment plans are not only costed, but they are prioritized for impact. One step further is matching the different funding streams to the funding priorities that exist. This is something that we've called within the Gates Foundation as fit-for-purpose financing to really improve the efficient allocation of different financing flows. Development finance providers can help by aligning the financing that they're providing with these priorities so that they can have the best impact possible. And I'd say growing discussion around country platforms, which is something that I think we'll see more and more of through 2025, going towards COP30, with several countries likely to present country platforms, their own country platforms. This is one way that we're seeing this whole focus around prioritization and results manifest. And as we see the new NDCs keep coming out and we think about implementation, we're going to see more and more around country platforms and the prioritization of investments and the matching of financial sources with the uses. So just to quickly recap, and then we can go to Q&A. The three things that I'm really looking out for in 2025 are: one, improving the pipes and making sure that the international financial system is more efficient and its institutions are working in better coordination and collaboration with each other. So improving the pipes. Second is the integrating climate into inclusive growth strategies in ways that are meaningful for countries. And I think we can also, it's not just a developing country thing. You look at developed countries when they're thinking about climate, environment, sustainability, and growth, there's very much a focus on things like what does it mean for jobs, for inclusive growth for communities. Look to the IRA in the US, look at the Green New Deal in Europe. It's common across all countries is that climate has to be a growth narrative or has to appeal to growth and have that connection to really drive meaningful change. So, and the last area was on prioritizing the high impact investments to really make sure that the money and resources that we do have go even further. So thanks. With that, I'll hand back to Karen.
Thank you very much, Matt, especially for two things of highlighting the issue of quality of finance and efficiency of how things get to countries and how they work in the system, but also for looking at the relatively shorter term. What do we do in 2025 and what do we need to put in place right now and not in 5 years or 10 years? I think that has given us a very good perspective. What I'm going to do now is I turn the word back to Amar. I saw him taking copious notes, and I'm sure he'll want to pick up on some of the things that you said. And so I want to give you a couple of minutes, Amar, but I'm also inviting the audience to type your questions or comments in the chat, and then we will be able to pick up on them. So far, I don't see anything actually that would have come from you. So I hope to see some of that, so we can spend the next 8 or 9 minutes that we still have before we wrap, and maybe see if we can get a question to the panel from you. Please, Amar, any reactions?
Thank you, Karen. I take copious notes when I'm in copious agreement. No, I thought there were some very, very important thoughts being put forward. Let me break my comments into two parts. One is what gives me cause for optimism, and second, what are the breakthroughs that we can see, building very much on what Matt said. So on the cause for optimism, I think we are at a perfect storm moment where technological advancement allows developing countries to leapfrog in the energy and resilience challenges. That's not just good for them, but creates the investment opportunity for the world. Okay, so I really think we are in a very special moment, but it requires seizing. So that's my first cause. Second is that much of what we are talking about is private sector now. 60% of the investments we enumerate are private sector investments. But what's the problem? One is we do not have the institutional structures as yet to kind of go to scale, and the access and cost to capital is a big challenge. If you look at Africa as an example, Africa has 60% of the best solar potential of the world, less than 2% of the investments. Now, one of the reasons is that a solar project in Africa costs 3 times that in Asia. And the second is the cost of capital in Africa is 3 times that of Asia. If we solve that, it's not just a solution for Africa, it's a solution for the world. So we have to think very creatively around this, the combination of technology and, I said, private sector. The public sector has a very central role to play in setting direction, in adaptation, resilience, loss and damage, insurance, everything that was talked about. And we have to find structures which bind which allow the public sector to lead, but which also binds the public sector and its development partners. And as Matt said, country platforms indeed is the way to go. Now, in terms of breakthroughs, therefore, let me just point to the following, which I think have to be focused on. We have to find a breakthrough on the debt and fiscal space issue. There are very divergent views on this. One view is you can't have any more debt. And my response is you can't have any more bad debt. Okay? But we need to have a discussion around the debt issue, and we are putting a lot of emphasis on that, therefore, this year. Second, how do we make country platforms a reality? And there are a range of things we can do, starting with the NDC partnership, starting with the G20 and reviving and re-strengthening the Global Compact with Africa, the initiatives that Brazil has locked on country platforms, and things that are happening autonomously. So I do think this is a great year to try and make breakthroughs on that, to create a virtuous cycle. I think, on the private sector, the total external private sector finance this year was about 30 billion. How much do we need? About 650 billion. That is the biggest stretch on climate finance. ODA is nothing compared to that, right? And establishing an architecture for unlocking that private finance has to be central to the global discussions this year. The MDBs have made important commitments, but implementation is very slow, and MDBs will need significant boost in firepower, and we have to think about this in very innovative ways to help them get that firepower. And last place where we need a breakthrough is moving beyond ODA to a reform of the concessional finance architecture. How much is the ODA component of climate finance? By 2035, it's about 100 billion compared to that 1.3 trillion I was talking about. But the needs for concessional finance are probably 3 times that much. So how do we deliver on what Matt was saying, which is how do we get the innovative options to deliver the concessional finance? So we see that as a really big ticket item for this year. So those are just my thoughts, but I think it's very important right now to have this kind of discussion so that we are setting, in some sense, the pathway for this roadmap from Baku to Belém and really helping to get an agenda. And the scaling community of practice can be a quite powerful ally as we set that trajectory. Thank you.
Thank you, Amar. Very important points and really summarizing of where to go. I have a question to either of you because I don't see any comments from our participants, but we still have some
Karen,
3 minutes.
There's a few in there. I'm not sure if you can see them, but they're.
No, I don't see anything in the chat. Can you pick it up, please?
I can, yeah. Yes, I can. The first question actually was for me, from Nancy, on the role of climate smart, sustainable infrastructure, climate smart standards. How does that support access to finance for infrastructure? So I know we have very limited time. I'll answer very briefly, but happy to pick this up separately. I mean, I definitely think, when you're thinking through what financing is available and what's the scarcest form, which is going to be grants and even concessional capital, how do you preserve that for where it can have the highest impact or where it's most needed, right, for a lot of the human development investments that don't have alternative financing? When you think through that lens, the role of policy and regulatory incentives to encourage investments aligned with sustainability and building climate resilience and infrastructure is critical. So I think this has a huge role to play. I think important to reflect on, when you have regulations or policies, sometimes they have costs, right? So you don't want to be penny wise and pound foolish by not building resilience into infrastructure now, when 10 years from now, it's going to reap tremendous returns by building that resilience design elements into it. But there has to be a careful consideration of which are the design elements, which are the standards that are necessary for what kind of investments, particularly in developing countries, so that we're getting the right level. We're not having stranded assets. We're not having costs that could have been avoided that we're actually seeing because we're not building in the resilience, but what are the right levels of those standards to put into place? So that's what I'd say very quickly. I don't know if you can see if anyone else can see the questions or if it's just me, but there's a couple other questions.
I just activated it. It was somehow on the wrong channel on my side. So thank you for that, for answering the question that was to you, Matt. And then there's another question here that's about the country platforms, which I think is a very relevant one from Johannes. In which way are they different from earlier country-led aid coordination efforts? Any one of you who wants to comment? I'm sure there's a number of viewers who are wondering about that.
Yeah, I just finished a day of discussion on country platforms, so I'm very happy to answer Johannes' question. So the first change, I would say, is recognizing that there needs to be quite a sharp and clear focus on a strategic objective. This is not a platform built around, general aid coordination for everything, but saying that we need system transformation in some particular focus area, whether that is the clean energy transition or even subsectors of it, whether it's adaptation and resilience or aspect of natural capital. It could, of course, be extended to education and sustainable infrastructure or whatever, but the idea here is first and foremost a clear strategic objective. A second agreement is articulation that then helps, in some sense, set objectives that can then be measured in terms of both action and impact. So very much right from the beginning, an impact focus that has to be there. Third, bringing in now relevant stakeholders where the private sector is very, very crucial. It's striking that in how many of the country platforms that are underway right now, how strong a role the private sector is playing. And the final part is financing plans that are predictable and credible. So it's not kind of a 1 year, consultative group arrangement, but recognizing that you are looking at 10, 15-year programs where we do need a mix of financing, but with predictability. Now, is that being done in any specific country platform in benchmark? The answer is no. But, is there a recognition that we need to move towards that direction? Very strongly. So I think there's going to be a meeting of the Financing for Commons Summit in the end of February in Cape Town, and there will be a 2-day discussion on country platforms there, bringing together different stakeholders, what's learned. And the good thing is that as countries recognize that this is a path to getting results and support, but also everybody recognizes this is about effectiveness and impact, then I think we are going to get to the Holy Grail. So I do think that there are quite important differences, Johannes, between this and the old style country platforms.
Thank you, Amar. I would love to have another round with all of you, but we're at the top of the hour, so I'm going to wrap it up. I hope that our participants enjoyed this webinar that we've brought to you from the Climate Change Working Group of the Scaling Community of Practice. We have more webinars to come up. We expect to have one on the tropical forest financing facility that has been proposed by Brazil, which would actually be one of these things that could facilitate the great expansion of concessionary finance in one important sector that lies between mitigation, adaptation, nature, and climate. So stay tuned on that. We expect to have a webinar on the systemic observation finance facility and early warning systems, meaning try to do things first and don't wait for catastrophes to happen, adapt in a different way. That also needs significant scaling. So stay tuned for this, and thank you once again to all of our speakers. It was a great discussion. One sees the depth that you have in these topics, and you've given all of us hope that we will move on the way from Baku to Belém, and that next year there will be strides in the right direction that we all need. So thank you, and thank you to all of the participants. Thank you. Bye-bye.